hello to everybody. Hi, this is Peter Fayroy, and I'm the great honor of being Greenhills head of school. And I've been having so much fun doing these interviews with our alums, and I've just been chatting with Geoff Chatas for a while. And that's one of the reasons why I like doing this, is our alums are fascinating. They're lovely human beings, and I love showing them all off to everybody and having these conversations. So nice to see you, Geoff. Now, little introduction. Geoff Chatas graduated from Greenhills School in 1981. I have your yearbook here, so I won't. I'll find your picture at some point. Geoff is one of 4 Chatas siblings who hold a Greenhills diploma, as well as a niece and nephew, Allie and Matt, who I know, Allie more than Matt. Geoff left Ann Arbor to earn his BA in history and economics from Georgetown University, and then attended Oxford University, where he received his master's in philosophy in history before pursuing his MBA at, correct me on this, INSEAD, yep. Which is a contraction of Institut Européen d'Administration des Affaires, right?
Yeah, yes, very well. It's very well said.
In France. And then, tiring of earning degrees, Geoff then used them to serve his alma mater, Georgetown University, as its senior vice president and chief operating officer. And before that, he was the CFO and vice president for business and finance at, am I reading that correctly? Ohio.
You go ahead.
A lesser podunk school in Columbus. He has also held key roles with the Ohio governor's task force on affordability and efficiency in higher education, the Infrastructure Investment Fund at JP Morgan Asset Management, and with Progress Energy, Inc., American Electric Power, Banc Capital Corporation, and Citibank. And super excitingly, Geoff has recently returned home to Ann Arbor to become the executive vice president and chief financial officer at the University of Michigan. So welcome, Geoff, and it's great to see you. And I want to apologize. I was supposed to come to University of Michigan's campus, and then you were going to come here, and because of the pandemic and other reasons. And then I had this nasty root canal that recently, and we had to postpone this. And, so maybe it's a segue to my first question. Given our Greenhills community and Ann Arbor community, with my root canal, it would have been even odds that I could have actually sort of had that done and an interview at the same time, given the number of docs in this. I think there are more dentists per capita in Ann Arbor than anywhere else in the country. But you came from this, you're a humanities guy. You had a history degree, and you came from Greenhills, which has always had a strong science and humanities. But then all of a sudden you find yourself in finance, business, economics. So you're sort of an unusual bird for us in pursuing this. What, how, why? How did you get there? And
I will tell you, but before I do, I want to invite so those of you fellow alums that know Ann Arbor, I'm in Fleming right now, which you all remember is that bunker building downtown, Peter, and we're about to move over to the old museum where we all went when we were students to see the dinosaurs, and my new office is on the top floor. So let's have a second meeting there. We're moving in 2 weeks.
Oh, that'd be great. Right? Only if I could bring my son, because he loves the museum.
So yeah, it is unusual. It's funny, when I was thinking about this too, I'll never forget that seminar we did junior year with, I think it was David, who did the history part, and then there was an English part as well, and it just sparked my imagination on education, learning, and that notion of combining disciplines. So in those days, I created my major, as I loved economics and I loved history, and I did my junior year at the London School of Economics, where I was able to do primary research with a professor as an undergrad, and was like, wow, this is awesome. Came back on fire, graduated, went to Oxford. And I was all set to kind of carry on and do a PhD. And so then you get to this question you asked. And one summer while I was at Oxford, I thought, well, just to make sure, I'm going to take an internship with a bank in Belgium. And I went over to Brussels and I worked at a bank. And my imagination caught on fire in the world of finance. And I'd been studying economic history. So I'd been looking at just this very esoteric. I did my thesis on the development of global markets from 1603 to 1780, which kind of, you'd say, what? Well, that's James the First to George the Third. And that's how they do things in England, right? They measure everything based on monarchs. Yeah. But I looked at with the initial development of global markets out of Bristol and London and the American colonies, and the role of evolving capital formation and all that. And so I then had this chance to do this job for summer, and I said, okay, this is really what I want to do. And so I was able to then turn that into a permanent first job in Switzerland with Citibank, like you said. And again, I credit Greenhills for so much of this. So my first job, I'm just out of grad school, and I'm working for the CEO of Citibank in Central and Eastern Europe. And he's saying, okay, our job is to figure out which countries we're going to expand the bank into and which we're not in Eastern Europe. And remember, this is 1988, so it's before the wall came down. And here I am meeting with foreign ministers in Russia and in Yugoslavia and Poland. And I was thinking, boy, you got some...
Sorry.
But he doesn't like that. Yugoslavia, I don't know, Serbia, maybe it's a Djokovic. But I had the courage of my conviction, and it goes back to that Greenhills experience. And you and I were talking about this a minute before, but the notion of developing us as young, confident people who are ready to go out and take on the world. And that's how it happened. So it went from there, and I just loved what I was doing. And then they said, hey, you ought to do an MBA. And at that point, I'd been in Europe for 6 years. So we did that in Europe, came back to New York with the bank. And by the way, that's where I met my wife, who's from Columbus, Ohio. So you're wondering, how did a guy from Ann Arbor end up? Well, I married a Buckeye. It happens.
Did she go to Ohio State also?
She did not. She went to Williams, but her dad went to Ohio State. My dad went to Michigan. So one of those things. And then back to Europe. But so that's how it started. And while I was doing all of this, I had been teaching at Oxford. And when I took a job back in Columbus, Ohio, after our daughter was born in London, I was still in banking and then working for a big energy company. I saw an ad in the paper one day, and it said, hey, would you like to teach an MBA program, corporate finance, Monday nights from 6 to 10. It's for adult students for Ohio Dominican University. And I did it. And I thought, well, this is fun too. So how do I marry both? How do I marry my passion for learning, my passion for finance? And so I then became CFO of that big public company, and that was in North Carolina. And the board chair happened to be the chancellor of UNC. And I said, I want to design a new kind of finance course to teach MBA students real world finance along with theory. So I did that for 3 years while I was working. And that's how this all started. So I kind of always kept the door in the education world while I was doing all this finance work. And here we are.
Wow. It is a journey. And obviously chance and luck always plays into all of our lives, but what is fortune favors the bold, or whatever the expression is, you prepared yourself to be able to take advantage of these opportunities. So, one of the things that I would love our alums to talk about with our current students and those that are going to see this, how did you do that? What advice would you give for our kids to, pursue your passions, but also remain open and be prepared to take advantage of those opportunities? How did you do that? And then what advice would you give our kids?
That's a great question. So first, work hard, honestly, do your homework, be prepared. But second, I've always been a big believer in options, having options, and always in my career, and always the way I approached how I thought about finance. And so I've always said that combination of being prepared, and options can be a fancy way of saying take risks, by the way, but take calculated risks. And so I think as you go through that journey and you look at those choices, you have to say, how do I make sure I have an ability to choose between things and I'm not being told what I have to do? And then the second thing is a frank discussion with yourself about how much risk are you willing to take.
Mm-hmm.
You've probably seen this in your time as a head of school, but there are various folks who approach taking risks in very different ways.
Right. Right.
And being comfortable with that, I think, is really important.
Yeah. 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 I always like it when I hear institutions encourage risk and failure, right?
Yeah.
But preparing, they're always tired expressions every 5 years in our business and education, but that idea of being resilient. But it's true, right? Places that prepare kids to take risks, fail, be resilient, and move forward. Well, while I have you, you're in higher ed. Our goal here is to help kids be successful in higher ed and then beyond. So a couple of specific questions while I have you. What are your thoughts on, higher ed in the years ahead? And not just student debt, though we'd love to hear you talk about that problem, right? What would you like to see happen with that problem? But also, how are things shaping? We've been talking about higher ed changing in the years to come, but what are your thoughts when you're sitting around the water cooler with your colleagues?
So, well, first, if COVID, this experience these last 2 years, has taught me anything and taught us anything as leaders in higher ed, our students value the in-person experience. And those who are out there thinking that we're about to go to a world of all online higher ed, I think it's the opposite. Mm. And, when you just look at, Peter, the sheer number of high school graduates every year demographically across the country, there are some for whom this higher ed online option will be the right one, but there are equally many, many more. I think I was just telling you the sheer numbers of kids we have applying for the spots, which aren't massively changing. So I think it reaffirms that. And then the question is, well, what needs to change as we go forward? And honestly, when you think about it, a student at a place like Michigan or Georgetown or even the Ohio State University spends 15 to 20 hours a week in class. And the rest of the time they're growing up, they're learning, right? And so where they live, how they engage with each other, how we think about wellness, how we think about mental health and interaction and life experiences, I think that's going to evolve. But I think the fundamental notion that our students want to learn in the classroom and engage with each other is stronger than ever.
Mm. How are kids going to pay for that in the future?
So that back to my work with the governor's task force. This is going to be the next major question, and because it already is. I've been now 12 years in higher ed, and it's been a major areas of focus of mine to say, look, and we talked about this a bit, there are always certain families that can pay the tuition. There are always certain families and students that will benefit from full scholarships. And then there's a group that we call the middle class, but a group in the middle that are going to be getting priced out of this equation if we're not careful. And so we're going to have to look at a combination of how we remain efficient, how we continue to work with our donors, by the way, to make sure we can provide more scholarships, but also how do we think about what we can do to help those middle class families get through without a crushing debt load. And oftentimes I'm learning we don't even know about the debt load, right? There's the stuff that we offer as debt to a student, but then there's debt families are taking on to pay for these opportunities. And so that's a critical area. So we're going to have to continue to work on that and focus on understanding how we can begin to think about changing the paradigm. And again, I'm too new in Ann Arbor, but I will tell you as an example at Ohio State, when I came in, I got to higher ed because I finished this work for JP Morgan, and Gordon Gee, who was the president of Ohio State, and I were having lunch, and I said, your economic model's broken. And he said, great, join me as the CFO and help fix it. That's how this all happened. If you'd have asked me in 1981 if I was going to be the CFO at Go Blue, Michigan, I would have probably laughed at you, but here we are, right? Wow. And one of the things he and I sat down, and it took a lot of work, but we actually froze tuition for 6 years, right? And that was the first step to say, and I'm not saying that works at every place, and I'm not saying it works in every situation, but it was our first attempt to say, what can we do to make sure that those who have to pay but are borrowing can pay a reasonable amount if it's possible.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be complicated. I'll stop at that. I think it's going to be challenging, but I think it's going to get worse and worse if we don't begin to address it.
So here's a question for you. If the Ohio State University and the University of Michigan's finance offices were to square off with you as quarterback for Michigan and whoever your successor is there, what you don't have to say who would win, but what are the differences? Like, what are if we were looking at the football teams, they have this, they have that, and this is this kind. Are there any differences between the two universities in terms of where they are located, their students, when you talk about freezing tuition? I don't know, I'm not sure where I'm getting at, but like, is it the same thing? Are there differences between being a school in Columbus and being a school in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, there are differences. First of all, so Ohio State's a land grant, right? Which is the Morrill Act. Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War set up these institutions to help prepare people for a future in a lot of fields. And so, for example, they have an ag school, they have a vet school, veterinary school. So they have these so they have an office in all 88 counties to help farmers still. Wow. And that's probably more like Michigan State than right. Michigan per se. And so that's one thing. I don't know if you know this, but until about 20 years ago, Ohio State was open admissions. So any kid could apply and go. Now it's competitive, and it's wildly competitive. And so in some areas, it's kind of merging more closely. But in terms of other demographics, we both have about the same level of state support in absolute dollar terms. I would say, I haven't looked at all the numbers. I would say we're still probably more exclusive than Ohio State, and we have a much bigger global attraction for undergrad students. It isn't, they have 8% international, or they did when I left, but in terms of attracting the top of the top students, that's still kind of an edge to Michigan. So a lot of things are similar, but a lot of things are different. They don't have nearly the endowment capacity we do. But they have a very engaged alumni group as well. So those things help shape it, but those are the major differences I see.
Okay. All right. So pretty soon then, that old joke from the old timers, I think there was a documentary, Michigan v. Ohio, and what was the joke he said? It was a guy from graduated in the 30s, and he said, well, when one year a student with the lowest GPA at University of Michigan was asked to leave, and he entered Ohio State that year, and the following year, the academic reputation of both schools increased dramatically.
There are other jokes. My son just graduated from Ohio State, and I have a daughter at med school at Michigan, so I'm going to be super careful.
Fabulous. Oh my gosh, must have been fun a couple of weeks ago.
It was. Those of you that saw our Christmas card will know it was a picture. The president gave us his tickets, so it was two of us in Michigan gear and two in Ohio State gear, and two of us were pretty happy. But yeah, no, honestly, just great students at Ohio State, great students at Michigan, and both places afford an amazing education.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it's where I came, right here down the street as an 18-year-old, about the same time you left for college too. Well, look, this has been terribly fun. The last question I have for you is, as a Greenhills student, if you could offer one piece of advice coming out of here, probably giving it to your own kids and your kids' friends, but what would you tell them?
I'd say it's two parts. I'd say remain curious, always remain curious, and Greenhills instilled that curiosity in me, and I'm sure most of our fellow graduates. And so don't lose that as you go through the journey of life. And then stay, at the end of the day, it's all about people. And so stay close to your friends, stay connected to people over time on your journey, because you can't go back. As I've learned, you come back to Ann Arbor, it's not going back, but it's going forward. But reconnecting with all these amazing folks from Greenhills has been probably one of the greatest joys of my life. And so I wish I'd done it earlier before I had this coming back to Ann Arbor, but I hope all of our alums don't lose that because it's just an amazing community.
Great. Well, we're so happy to have you back.
Thank you.
And to have had you do this, and we look forward to having you on campus very soon.
Great.
And I'll come see you over at the museum for sure.
Deal.
All right. All right. Well, thanks again for doing this, Geoff.
Okay,
right.
take care.
Bye-bye.